Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today, Phili joins us. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure to
Thank
be
you for
here.
thank you for coming on. I think this will be a good one for the listeners. We don't often talk about this too much, I guess, on the podcast, and I guess a lot of combat athletes kind of fall down this path of wanting to improve mobility for various reasons. Usually, it's to get into different submissions or out of different submissions. So, do we start with a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into the mobility, information.
Sure. So again, my name's Matt Philly. I am the founder and CEO of Primal Mobility. We help a lot of barbell athletes, so we mainly focus on CrossFit, powerlifters, weightlifters, strongman, stuff like that. That being said, the information and just the nuances to the movement and the nuances to mobility in general, the laws, for example, they kind of apply universally. So I'm excited to kind of dive into this topic of more along the lines of combat sports. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's the thing. That's why I like bringing on people, not just within one space, because again, the laws of training, mobility, whatever it is, apply across all sports. It's just small, minor changes you might make. So let's start with mobility. Let's start with defining what mobility is, because I think a lot of people might be thinking mobility, flexibility, stretching, all that is all under the same umbrella. So let's start with defining mobility.
Yeah, I think that's an important one to start with for sure too. So a lot of people, when they start considering mobility, they use flexibility and mobility interchangeably and kind of think of the two as one and the same. The way we describe it is flexibility is more along the lines of increasing ranges of motion, increasing capacity of a particular joint and the potential that it holds. And then mobility is creating more along the lines of the full on capabilities of that joint. So now we're talking about strength, we're talking about movement control, stability, the awareness and connection to those ranges of motion. So to simplify that, we say that mobility is more like flexibility plus strength.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Let's dive into some practical areas within mobility then. So someone's listening to this and they want to get started. I mean, you've started jiu-jitsu semi recently, so you've been well involved within there, and you understand some of the, I guess, positions that require more mobility than others. For example, even just the basic triangle choke, having to get your hip externally rotated enough to be able to put that on isn't easy for a lot of people. Even myself, I struggle to turn my hips there as well. So where would someone start with mobility training? Can they just go on YouTube and find, yoga for jiu-jitsu kind of channels or yoga channels? Is that adequate enough for someone to do?
So the way I like to look at it is that mobility training should be progressive. Again, mobility training is a strength-based protocol. You need to approach it in a way that is progressive. So that means you need to regress it to a point to meet you where you're at. So just like you wouldn't throw 400 pounds on a barbell and get under it right away, um, within your first month of squatting, you're not going to want to essentially just dive right into more intense mobility training right off the bat. So, of course, getting started, we're just going to want to try and apply more range of motion in very simple, basic capacities, right? So, going on YouTube is definitely not a bad way to start off. Once you want to actually make legitimate progress that is going to take you to the next level with your mobility, you're going to have to find a way to start loading and applying progressive overload principles, and which can be quite challenging in the grand scheme of things for mobility, as we don't often use much external loading like barbells, kettlebells, dumbbells, that kind of stuff. We need to apply progressive overload principles, but more with internal strength protocols. So now we're looking at, instead of adding weight, we're now looking at reducing rest. We're now looking at increasing volume. We're now looking at increasing range of motion and the stimulus in that way, or increasing tempo. So you got to look at it. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve out of it? And that's going to dictate what is sufficient in your approach. So if you're just like, I just want to recover better, YouTube is fantastic. It's free. You don't have any intense goals that are going to be requiring any kind of like highly detailed approach. So I would say that's a great approach. But if you're looking to reduce pain or seriously reduce risk of injury depending on, let's say you've injured your ACL in the past and you really want to avoid that in a, like for heel hooks or something in the future. You're going to want to make sure that you progressively overload those biomechanics to make sure that they're prepared to accept stress, like through jujitsu and various different other challenges like that.
Nice. And before we dive into some exercise examples, maybe, do you want to maybe dive into why some people might go on a stretching regime? They want to get more mobile or flexible, but they don't really see the changes in range of motion over the weeks and months as they do it. So I don't know. Maybe someone's decided they're doing yoga at home for 15 minutes a night, and they're doing maybe the same stretches, couch stretch, something else for the hips, and something for the doorway pec stretch and stuff. But they're not seeing that change. Do you want to maybe dive into why that might be and what they can do instead?
Well, something that we're noticing that is happening frequently is that, again, kind of what I was just mentioning previously, is that there is no progressive overload approach to it. It is not being approached in the same manner somebody would approach a strength protocol.
Hmm.
And that seems to be where the biggest fallback is. People aren't approaching their mobility training with enough intensity. So they're really approaching it in more of like a feel good type situation.
Yeah.
Whereas the way we approach it with our clients, it's like, this should be really challenging. This should be very hard and should kind of rival your workouts with how much effort you're putting into it. And that's where the true gains will come from. And this is why our clients will see progress within a very short period of time, because we're showing them, stop taking it easy in your mobility training, put the effort in. Like we have an RPE scale that we work with to show people this should not be a 3. This should be more like an 8. This should have you feeling like you need to rest after 1 or 2 reps, that kind of thing. Yeah.
What's an example of an exercise that would elicit like an RPE 8 after 1 or 2 reps, like a mobility exercise?
It could be a lot of things. Like we implement around 8 to 10 techniques of training, and then of course you can have like the individual work exercises within each technique. So CARS is controlled articular rotations. The
Hmm.
concept of CARS is basically to just take any particular joint through its full range of motion with as little compensation from other areas as possible. And with that, we generally want to apply a high level of effort to it. So we'll bring people, or we'll suggest that our people go through like a 9 out of 10 RPE on their hip cars, for example. And every single rep we'll suggest take like a 5 to 10 second rest in between, because we want to make sure that you're actually moving accordingly. And then, of course, there's like eccentrics, right? So we could look at
Hmm.
like a sumo squat, like a deep, wide, almost horse stance position, very, very wide, and control 10 seconds from top to bottom into those deepest ranges of motion where you could feel the knees trying to cave in, but you're
Hmm.
to keep them open. Those are exercises that we can absolutely start getting higher up with the RPE scale. And something like an eccentric sumo, you can definitely load it up as well quite easily,
Yeah.
like heavy kettlebells, barbells, whatever, and really apply the stimulus in that regard.
At what level do you start to load someone in some of these positions? Because you mentioned someone starting might start with some YouTube stuff, maybe some stretching stuff, whatever it is, and kind of progress as they overload. At what point do you start to look to add load where you're not going to maybe, I don't know, potentially cause an injury and kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. But with the nuances to mobility, we need to make
Mm.
sure that one, the mechanics, the movement patterns are on point. So what is the goal at hand? So if we're trying to help somebody improve their squat depth or just improve the position in general, one, we need to make sure that their squat pattern looks sound, technically sound, it looks good. We need to make sure that they're in their ideal stance, first of all. And then on top of that, we need to also make sure that when they're going through these patterns, these movements, these techniques without loading, without the insane intensity that we're trying to apply as they progress, are they compensating? If they're compensating, they're showing signs that their nervous system doesn't quite have those patterns down yet, doesn't have those ranges of motion down yet. and we are at a higher likelihood of causing risk of injury if we begin to load too rapidly. So we look at how their body begins to compensate and how their movement patterns are already ingrained and if they're ready to be loaded.
Gotcha. Let's go into some examples. You mentioned cars just before. Do you want to maybe
Yeah.
provide an example of a car's exercise and maybe just go a little bit into what you're trying to achieve with doing? I mean, maybe the shoulder cars or something like that's probably the easiest to show on the camera there, but even just what you're trying to achieve kind of doing that kind of exercise?
For sure. So cars, I feel like cars are potentially like the golden exercise when it comes to mobility. They're not fantastic for like flexibility. It's not going to necessarily help you improve the potential of the joint. It's like in potential range of motion, I should say, because it absolutely can improve the potential in terms of like power output of the joint. Um, but when it comes to like flexibility, increasing ranges of motion, cars are not going to be great. But when it comes to learning control and creating that neurological connection with those deeper ranges of motion, so essentially teaching your nervous system that those ranges of motion are controllable and you have the ability to manage them, your body will begin to start holding on to those ranges a lot more effectively. So that's one of the reasons we use it so frequently is that you're teaching your body that you want to use these ranges of motion more frequently so your nervous system doesn't get rid of them as it may seem like they're unnecessary, right? Our body, the way I like to say it is that our body is like an adaptation machine. If our body deems something unnecessary, it's going to get rid of it very quickly. So cars is a great way to show your body that these ranges of motion are necessary because we're applying them frequently. So essentially, I'll do shoulder cars very,
Mm-hmm.
very poorly, but just to show you guys kind of an example of what we're looking for. So again, it's to bring the entire the joint through its entire range of motion with as little compensations as possible. So I would want to make sure that we're being very strict with the movement, but also bringing as much engagement to the particular joint as well. So we may want to recruit more muscles surrounding the joint to help bring more engagement to the particular joint. But what we're going to do is bring it to its full flexion, and then we're going to begin moving through the full rotation as we begin kind of going around the world in a way, all the way back to that starting point. And then you can see that I'm rotating as I go. So again, the way I would apply this, I would be fully contracted, going with a lot of intensity and making sure that I'm not opening up or I'm
Gotcha.
not bending my elbow or shrugging. These are all compensations that as a coach, I would be looking out for to see how connected to their ranges of motion are they really? Because I've seen people get crazy ranges of motion with their shoulder, but at like a finer eye and looking a little closer, we're seeing a little shrug of the shoulder, or we're seeing that they're bending their elbow when they're back here, or maybe they're opening their torso a little bit and causing those compensations. So I guess from the perspective of like a newer coach, a newer mobility coach, it may seem like this person's ready to start loading up particular ranges of their shoulders when in reality they're still showing signs of compensations that show they're not prepared yet. They don't have those patterns, those movements ingrained.
Before getting back to the podcast, I want to let you know there's a link down in the description for the Sweet Arts of Fighting underground community. You can get all the help you need for your combat sports training. You get every single Sweet Arts of Fighting training program, online course, and you get access to a range of coaches within the private Discord community. So go check that out, and back to the podcast. So how would you address some of those compensations then? I'm assuming it might be different things, but let's say like they're opening up or someone's shrugging while doing it. How would you address that within those cars?
Cues. Like
Just cues. There wouldn't be other. So there's not other exercises that you need to do. It would just be cueing to stay.
yeah, well again that totally depends, right? It's
Yeah,
like first teaching somebody how to squat who's never squatted before. Like let's
gotcha.
say with a barbell on their back. That's like at first they're going to be moving all weird and wonky until they learn the proprioception, the awareness of how their body's moving through space, right? So we'll probably give them a shit ton more reps. I don't know if I can curse on your podcast, so sorry.
Yep, of course, of
Okay.
course.
So we'll be giving them a shit ton more reps, most likely, to help them ingrain the pattern and show their nervous system. And over time, it generally starts to get better and better,
Mm,
especially when we give them the cues first and tell them what we're looking for and what we're looking at, and then give them all the new reps. So now
got
they
it.
know they're more intentional going through the movement. They're thinking, oh, I can't open my torso. I feel myself doing it now, and so on and so forth. So usually what I'll say is, have a look back at your video at this moment. What do you see? And then they'll come back with, I don't know, or so whatever. It depends on the individual, of course. And then we'll start chatting about what it is and why that's happening, and so on. The education behind it is very important when it comes to like such fine movements, because essentially what we're doing is isolating biomechanics and building control and strength within them like that. So it's usually
Gotcha.
cues and just more reps.
Gotcha. And a very generic question for, because obviously it depends on the individual, but maybe one of your go-to or favorite exercises for improving shoulder mobility. Maybe we can even put it in a combat sports context, but is there something that you typically like to have people do that's common among a lot of your different clients?
Yeah, well, are we talking specifically shoulders, or it doesn't really matter?
We can do shoulders, and if there's anything else, we can cover those too.
Well, actually, I think I would like to take it back a sec and say
Mm-hmm.
that one of the most common issues with people making progress in their mobility is because they're just not consistent enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's a lot of the time is because people don't generally see mobility as something as a necessity. They don't
Yeah.
see it as something that's quite enjoyable compared to like their average training, right? Like you're talking with a lot of combat athletes. That shit's fun. It's addicting, and uh, training your hips in certain positions can be very challenging at first, and it can show that, or it can feel like the progress behind it is very slow. So a lot of people will put mobility training on the back burner, and the way we like to approach it to make sure that we can ensure that our people are growing and progressing are trying to make mobility training fun. So the reason I took it back to that was basically to say that when we're presenting a mobility program to someone, we're trying to throw things in that are clearly unique and get people in weird positions that are going to feel good at first, and then are going to challenge them in a big way quite quickly after that. So for a lot of people, um, some of my favorite things to do are getting them in the frog position and putting in a lot of work there, because not a lot of people will get their hips open to that degree.
Mm,
And training their internal hip rotation within that position can go a very long way, especially for people in jiu-jitsu that are constantly in the guard position and stuff like that. Um, so I would say like the frog is anything in frog, usually like frog internal liftoffs. It's going to sound really confusing from people who have no idea what mobility training is.
mm.
These types of things, anyways, like cars, pails, rails, and eccentrics, like it probably sounds like I'm speaking a different language right now, but um,
I have to put some video over top.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I have some videos I could share too if you'd like. I would say like frog stuff and pigeon stuff. So the reason I like those
Mm.
a lot is because we're going to show people how their average stretches that they use. So a lot of people, their go-to will be the pigeon stretch or a couch stretch, for example, right? And we like to get people in those positions and then apply a different type of stimulus.
Hmm.
And that shows them like, holy shit, I've been in this pigeon position like 1,000 times, but this is next level. And my hips feel incredible after 2 minutes, as opposed to maybe it would take normally like a week of being consistent with the stretching of that position, right? So I would say those two are very common of how we like to influence people on quick progress, quick
Yeah.
joy
So,
of mobility training.
so you mentioned about hitting them with a different stimulus in those positions. What would an example of that be?
So a good example probably is like pigeon squats or frog squats. Like essentially, picture yourself doing an elevated pigeon, an elevated pigeon position where you're up on a box or you're up on a bench, and you get your leg in the pigeon position there, and then you let yourself lower, but you are completely controlling how you're lowering.
Mm.
And then you drive your knee into the bench and push yourself back up to that
Ooh,
starting position.
that's brutal.
Very challenging on the glutes. External hip rotation is pretty intense for sure, but like that's a good example of applying a very different stimulus from just holding a classic static pigeon stretch.
Yeah. No, I really like that. I mean, yeah, I can barely do a proper pigeon position. So if I do that, I have to have my hands on the bench to lower myself down and get back up. I mean, my hips are damn tight. But is there a point where maybe someone is, I don't know if it's genetic or structural or something, where things just don't change even with mobility training? Have you come across something like that at all?
Yeah, I mean that definitely happens quite frequently too. Like you can't change anatomy
Mm,
through mobility training, right? So that comes down to the coach, like the mobility coach. We have 7 coaches on our team. It comes down to the individual coach helping the client set expectations accordingly.
yeah.
So somebody that wants to come in with a terrible squat pattern, and they're like, I need to be able to squat ass to grass. After further assessment, we realize your hip anatomy and your anthropometry, like the length of your femurs and stuff like that, it's just not happening. There's just no way you're going to get there. It's just not structurally possible. And, obviously being a little bit more empathetic when approaching that. Uh, but that's essentially what the conversation will come down to is like, first of all, you shouldn't be squatting in this position. You're never going to have like a nice upright squat pattern. Trying to squat in a very narrow stance when you have long ass femurs, it's just not going to happen. You're going to be leaning forward like crazy. And it's, we just got to set expectations accordingly when you face those types of challenges, I think.
Yeah. Nice. And the other one is breathing during some of these exercises. I know I've watched Mona do a fair few different things with the exercises that you guys have and the different breathing that she has to do during exercises. Do you maybe dive into how someone can use breathing to, I guess, improve their mobility training?
Yes. So there's a lot of people that'll talk about breathing exercises and all that
Mm,
stuff. We don't dive into that. Like we're not training the diaphragm and whatever else, which I mean could definitely have its pros to working on. What we're usually approaching is how you should be breathing during your particular mobility training exercises. So again, some exercises are going to be better for recovery, some are going to be better for more warm up or legitimate mobility training approaches. And something that we like to say is essentially mobility training is a game of influencing the nervous system. And the way you breathe has a big impact on how your nervous system responds. So if our goal is to help you recover faster and elicit a response of recovery, and that way you can hit the next day, you're training the next day just as hard, if not harder, we need to make sure that you're not ramping up the nervous system right after you just went through your training protocol. We need to make sure that you are calming things down, letting your body start to recover and go through that process. So there's different ways that somebody should be breathing depending on what the goal is. So again, think of it this way. If your goal is to recover or calm the nervous system, we need to slow breathe, deep breaths, minimal breathing in terms of like how many breaths are you taking in a minute. And then if the goal is the opposite, like we want to ramp up the nervous system and prepare you for your training or prepare your joints for putting in some serious work for your mobility training. When I say prepare you for your training, I'm talking like maybe you're going in for like a heavy rolling session or maybe you're going into like squat heavy that day. You want to prime your joints. Those days, or in those situations, I should say, you want to have some more intense, rapid breathing, some stronger breathing patterns where you're exhaling harder or that kind of stuff.
gotcha. And you mentioned obviously the different goals of the different sessions. So you had like when we talked about recovery there, maybe doing it at the end of your session or before your session to kind of ramp yourself up. Do you want to maybe give a couple of examples of how those sessions look in terms of the recovery versus the, I guess, before training?
Yeah. So recovery will often look at things that are going to be applying deep ranges of motion in a gentle manner. So you'll see things like flows, you'll see things like static stretching that's a great opportunity to get into those static stretching positions and just hold it and let the tissues kind of experience those deeper ranges of motion to help reduce the DOMs, the muscle soreness. Um, that's kind of how it looks generally, is very gentle stuff. So that's kind of like the main thought process I want people going into when they're doing their recovery is like, how can I do this but be gentle through the process? That's what your
Mm.
body needs for the recovery, right? If we're going to be aggressive, your nervous system is going to stay fired, and it's going to take you much longer to recover from the process. So we got to make sure that things are gentle, calm, deep breathing, slow movements, deep ranges of motion without intensity, that kind of stuff. And then the opposite is true for applying, like, let's say, a mobility training session where now you're focusing, like, you're dedicating 30 minutes to specifically improving those deep ranges of motion of your hips. Now you're going to want to kind of give yourself like a little warm up for the hips, and then you're going to want to apply those heavier breathing patterns. And so what that would look like essentially is when you're getting into the thick of it, you're getting into those deep ranges of motion, and then you're forcing yourself to use them in a way that's going to challenge you at a very intense level. So again, the pigeon squats is a great example.
Hmm.
You get into a deep pigeon position, your glutes are lengthened, you feel a huge stretch in your ass. And then from there, you're going to have to apply that range of motion by driving your knee into the floor as hard as you can, right?
Mm.
So let's, like, for example, just the classic pigeon stretch. When you get into that deep pigeon stretch, big stretch in your glutes, right?
Hmm.
People will normally hold that position and stay calm and relax there. But instead, you can drive your knee into the floor really hard, and now you're training your glute while it's in length. So now
Hmm.
you're training your glute while it's in that deep stretched position. And that's going to train your nervous system that, oh shit, we need to be able to use these muscles in those deep ranges of motion. So we better be able to hold on to those positions and essentially make it easier to get into next time. It's classic adaptation, right?
Yeah. Nice. Nice. I like that. And then I guess within a training week, so I guess a lot of combat athletes, they're already short on time. Maybe they're working full time. They're training multiple disciplines in the week. Plus, they're trying to add their strength conditioning on top. As you mentioned, mobility training is almost kind of last on the list. So, where
Yeah.
does someone fit some of these exercises in without having to maybe block out another 30 or 60-minute session out of the week so they can get it done?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most common
Mm.
hiccup or roadblock that we'll experience in our company is that we have to find ways to apply this training to people without giving them a shit ton more like homework and time in their day, right? So the way I like to do things is, one, we need to understand their lifestyle and their schedule to be able to apply the protocol for them in the most effective manner. But you can really do some solid work with just 2 to 3 exercises for sure. We don't program anything more than 4 exercises per session. So depending on the person, we can have 1 session per day. We can have 4 sessions per day. It depends on who they are and what their goals are, of course. But we'll never program more than 4 exercises, as you don't need it. You can make some serious gains with very few exercises. You can do 1 to 2 exercises and you could be good, or you can go up from there, right? So I would say for those that are really busy and concerned with that, then starting with like, what's the one stimulus my body needs? And I'm going to focus on that for 2 to 4 weeks. And that's the exercise we're going to be applying maybe 4 to 6 times per week. And if
Gotcha.
you're that busy, then 1 to 2 exercises, that's it.
Could it be easily done, for example, maybe superset as part of their strength conditioning stuff if they're maybe doing, I don't know, squats, deadlifts, whatever it is already, and supersetting with that? Or is this something that's kind of too intense to superset with bigger exercises? You want to superset it with maybe easy exercises, or you want to do it maybe after you've done your combat technical training before, that kind of thing, just to be able to fit it in?
Yeah, exactly. Like we will tell our people that generally speaking, the mobility training is most often best applied right before the workouts.
Okay.
um, unless you are going to test like a max, or you have a really heavy day ahead of you. You're going to
Mm,
be taxing your system too much, and you're going to be too fatigued to hit the numbers that you're potentially trying to hit. So it's definitely something that you can apply during your training protocol, but it's something you want to be like conscious of with what are your goals and how are you approaching your training protocol for that day. So usually it's best if you have like a separate chunk of time to get it in. But if you're trying to be as like efficient as possible, you can definitely do it that way because it's kind of like it's very cohesive. Mobility training and resistance training is very cohesive, and it should be supporting your mobility
mm,
training should be supporting your resistance training, like
yeah.
your training.
Yeah, I mean, mobility training based, I mean, it is resistance training, especially with the
Yeah,
exercises that you're mentioning anyway. So it's, I mean, it could even be, they could even, a lot of them could even be like your accessory exercises in the gym, right? So if you're doing like your main strength power stuff, maybe you finish your session with a couple of those exercises. Because
right.
yeah,
Yeah, a
that's,
lot of people will actually say that our work feels more like accessory work
mm,
than it feel like a stretching protocol.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I wanted to get your take as well on yoga. So a lot of, I mean, jujitsu and yoga are almost synonymous. Everyone who does jujitsu does yoga of some form. So obviously there's different forms and things like that. I'm not too familiar with all the different kinds, but just your general opinion on using yoga, and we'll put it in the context of mobility. Is that something that someone can benefit from in that context? And if not, are there benefits to doing, I guess, yoga for combat sports, or are there drawbacks that people should be aware of doing that as a combat sport athlete?
So one of the biggest benefits that I think is worth discussing is that your mobility training should directly provide proprioceptive gains. So like when I say proprioception, that means the awareness of where your body is in space as you're moving. Your mobility training should be applying proprioceptive gains to what you're trying to achieve outside of it. So if you're not able to isolate the positions that you know you need to improve, it becomes very challenging to apply those gains into your practice of whatever that is, right? So, for example, like the guard position, having the legs in that position, the hips opened up, and let's say somebody tries to pass your guard and presses down on one knee, and now you're in like a deep like frog stretch type position where the hips are just way open and the groin is stretched out. We need to be able to isolate that and make sure that we can apply movement control within it, because if you're drilling with someone or if you're rolling, for example, and somebody presses you in that position, you're not going to just be static in that position. You're going to be engaged and active and trying to fight back, right? So we need to make sure that the approach that you're taking is going to create proprioceptive gains and help you understand how to use and move your body out of those positions more effectively in the scenario when it's demanded on. So yoga is fantastic for getting you into positions, but it's not fantastic for teaching you how to use them and move in and out of them effectively. Whereas mobility training, we now look at isolating those biomechanics of the various different joints and then apply the stimulus that way. So we can easily get you into these various positions that are challenged throughout whatever practice you're trying to improve, and then apply the stimulus and progressive overload principles to that. So
Mm,
mobility training is much more effective, in my opinion. And I'm sure we would get some backlash from that, but it might definitely far more effective for a very specific goal than yoga training would be.
yeah, no, I agree with you there. I've got an article on the site, kind of. I wouldn't say trashing yoga, but kind of trashing yoga versus other forms of training. But we actually got a comment on YouTube from Brandon Williams saying he really likes your Instagram. So you're obviously
Oh,
doing
cool.
some doing some good content on there that people are following. And I guess if anyone's listening to this and now in the future, you can jump on and join these live and ask questions and anything you want while we're on here recording. And also after the podcast too, but we'll also link up Matt's Instagram and all this stuff after this too in the description. But I don't think I have too much more to ask you, Matt. Is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation? And if not, do you want to maybe plug Primal Mobility and where they can find you and follow you and get more information and exercises and all sorts of ideas from you.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thanks to Brandon, was it?
Yep.
Brandon, yeah, cool. I appreciate that. That's an awesome little shout out there. So thanks for that. Otherwise, I don't really have too much else. Like I could talk about mobility literally all day, and so I have to kind of force myself to take a step back whenever I need to. But what we're doing at Primal Mobility is, in my opinion, we are revolutionizing the mobility industry, particularly in the fact that we are teaching people how to become mobility coaches, which is a very underdeveloped niche in the fitness industry. As the problems that we're solving as mobility coaches is rampant. Everyone's struggling with pain of some sort or old injuries that keep bouncing back, that are plaguing their fitness journeys and that kind of stuff. And teaching people how to essentially develop a protocol around that and create a business around it. We've done it, and we know that the industry has a massive gap there for others to be able to create a lucrative business around it. So that's the direction we're really trying to go right now. However, we'll never stop coaching. We have 7 coaches on the team that are very focused on bringing people in and helping support them and develop strength through their joints and show them what their body can truly feel like, and that they don't need to train with all this pain. Like I can't even tell you when I go to jujitsu, and I'm pretty sure 99.9% of people there are telling me their knees broken or their
They're back.
their shoulder, their neck, right?
Yep.
All these different things. That's what we do as well. Is essentially we dive in there and we show people how to strengthen those areas without any equipment. Um, so if you guys want to learn more about what we do, or if you just have more questions about mobility training, or you're curious about it, a really great place to start would be our free Facebook community, where we're constantly putting in new resources and just giving out as much support and information as we can for free, until it's clear that you need to go a step further and get a program and get involved with a coach. That's a great place to get started. So I would say check out the Primal Mobility free community on Facebook. That's what it's called. And that's about it.
Sweet.
Otherwise, check out Instagram.
Yeah, I'll link that up on Instagram. We actually had another comment from Brandon here. He's saying he's got pretty good flexibility, and a guy was passing his guard, pushed his legs to the right, and pinned his left shoulder. So pushed his right leg and then pinned his left shoulder and popped a rib, and that wasn't fun.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that's
that's a pretty extreme position. Shoulder
so.
down, leg
Yeah,
going.
right leg is pinned down to the floor, and then left shoulder being pinned down.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, right leg and left shoulder.
So it's
Yeah.
like the chiropractor. Your whole
Yeah.
spine rotating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not surprised to hear that, because if the ribs are restricted, then the spine is not going to rotate very good. So if somebody's forcing you into that position, something's got to give, right?
Hmm.
Uh, I would suggest, especially for not like jiu-jitsu athletes, shoulder external rotation, of course, internal, like shoulder rotation in
Yeah.
general for those Americanas and Kimuras. You're going
Oh
to want
yeah.
to improve those positions. Like that'll help you avoid submissions. Not necessarily. If your game sucks, then you're not going to avoid
Yeah.
submissions. But it'll help you avoid injury in those situations. And then neck extension, building strength through that will be a very important aspect to helping keep your neck safe. And then hip rotation as well. Those will be
Nice.
like very important things. Did I mention the
Yeah.
thoracic? There's
I
too
don't know,
much.
but let's jump into thoracic in a sec. I know I said we're going to end, but I've got more questions. Brandon says that that's exactly what it was. He's going to check out your Facebook group. But
Cool.
regarding thoracic, obviously strikers tend to have a very kyphotic upper back just from being around it. I mean, even jiu-jitsu players too, and wrestlers, depending on the postures they have. Do you, what do you recommend for people to, I guess, start to I don't know, improve that, mobilize that, if they're having issues maybe at the shoulder level because of that?
Yeah, the so it's kind of like a full spectrum type thing. You need to have, if your shoulders aren't moving well, you should probably start by looking at the thoracic spine. If the thoracic spine is restricted, then your scapula cannot move effectively. If your scapula cannot move effectively, your shoulders will definitely not move effectively. So we need to make sure that the thoracic is moving well. And the way I would begin is just by getting into simple extension based exercises while staying intentional about not flaring through the ribs. So, a really classic
Hmm.
example would be like the foam roller stretch where you get on the foam roller and you do one of those.
Yeah.
Great stretch to go through, and it opens up the thoracic spine. Feels amazing. Everyone loves that one. But a lot of people will end up opening up at the ribs and just flaring at the ribs, and their thoracic spine is basically getting like very minimal amounts of extension through that because the ribs are just taking all that range of motion. So we want to get as strict as possible. So make sure your pelvis is neutral, so your lumbar spine isn't going into extension, and that you're keeping those ribs as neutral as possible, and making sure you feel like a nice deep stretch through the thoracic spine area, and move through those intentional patterns more frequently, and then start applying rotation patterns.
Mm.
It's hard for me to just explain
Hmm.
just with words, but rotation is going to be a big benefit to you. Improving rotation is going to be a big benefit to you, especially considering the injury of popping a rib with from spinal rotation.
Yeah. I guess the other question around the thoracic stuff, how do you end up? Obviously, we talked about the hips and we can load it through various resistance and tension through the body weight. But obviously, with thoracic, it's a little hard, even thoracic extension, it's a little harder to load those positions. So, how do you end up progressing those then from that kind of body weight to loading?
You use as much gravity as you can.
Okay.
Essentially, you apply more local recruitment of the surrounding musculature. So you learn to engage the muscles that surround the thoracic spine more effectively and bring more intensity to that. So that's how, and then essentially reducing the compensations as much as possible as well. So you just become better at controlling the ranges of motion. Your proprioception becomes stronger within those ranges as well. And over time, that goes a very long way in terms of the progressive overload principles. Because again, a lot of mobility is challenging to load with external loading, with like
Yeah.
dumbbell stuff like that. A lot of it is challenging. So it comes down to learning how to engage the muscles as much as possible, and then moving through very strict patterns of movement without compensations.
Perfect. Okay, I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast there. So for anyone, check the description. There's going to be links to Matt's stuff where you can learn some more mobility. Obviously, there's also the Sweet Sides of Fighting Underground where you can be on these and the members only audience too. We can chat afterwards, all sorts of stuff there. Has all the training programs, all that good stuff. But tune in later this week. We have another podcast going, and obviously every Monday this will be released. So thanks for coming on, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. It was great. I love talking. So thank you so much for giving me a platform. I
No,
appreciate it.
cheers.